Okay, so hello everyone, good afternoon and good evening. This is Muhammad Danial Kamal, and on the behalf of the Buraaq Association, I am delighted to see such a diverse and engaged audience here once again today. So, I know you all are joining it online, and thank you for making time to be a part of this important conversation. And let me just remind you, why are we here? We know that the world is facing an unprecedented challenge that is accelerating the climate action while ensuring a just transition for all nations, and particularly those most vulnerable to climate impacts. And at the heart of this challenge lies a critical question: how do we mobilize the finance that is needed to make this transition a reality? And henceforth, the climate finance isn't just about numbers on a balance sheet, it's about enabling developing nations to properly have the impact and to build resilience, transition to clean energy, and protect their communities. And it's also about bridging the gap between climate ambition and financial reality. And although throughout this leadership series, we have brought together thought leaders, practitioners, innovators, and this time negotiators in climate finance. And we believe that this thing will prove to be beneficiary for all of you, as understanding these mechanisms and forging meaningful partnerships is essential to scaling the climate action globally. And today we are deep diving into one of the most critical mechanisms of climate finance, and we will be discussing the topic. And this is, to me, one of the most important topics if you are starting or if you are properly developing your career in climate finance. And the topic is the role of international financial institutes in climate finance. So, throughout this whole topic, we will be channeling the resources towards climate solutions. And let us just move forward together. So, now it is with great honor I will welcome our distinguished guest speaker today. And please join me in welcoming Ma'am Dolphine Magero. And she is a climate and carbon finance negotiator from Kenya. And Ms. Dolphin properly brings invaluable expertise and on the ground experience to this conversation as a lead negotiator on climate and carbon finance. She has been like at the forefront of international climate discussions, including the UNFCCC processes, and recently she represented and properly dealt with all the climate finance negotiations that happened in UNSP 64 that happened just in the last month in Bonn, Germany. And if we talk about Kenya's leadership in climate action and its strategic positioning in East Africa, let me just tell you, it's very particularly vital because we have the privilege, and today we will be discussing a lot. We will be discussing that how international financial institutions are reshaping climate finance delivery. We will be discussing some of the practical pathways, and alongside this, we maybe deep dive into the opportunities and challenges from a developing nation's perspective. And Ma'am Dolphin, we are honored to have you once again with us and grateful for the insights you will be sharing with our community, with our fellows today. The floor is yours, ma'am. Over to you.
Thank you for this opportunity. Uh, like Here, as I highlighted, basically, I'm always happy to share with young people. I started engagement on climate change while I was, I think, in my second year, while I was doing my bachelor's at the university. And yeah, we've had a bit of milestones that have been able to we've been able to achieve and a lot of wins. But yeah, I look forward to having these discussions with you and having more of an interactive session because I find it more beneficial when it's not one person talking, but there's more interaction. It should be a back and forth, which usually tends to enrich the discussions. So I look forward to engaging with all of you and yeah, and learning also as well from you because of course no one is the wealth of no one holds all the knowledge. So I'm sure you also know something about climate change and climate finance. And it would be good. I could also learn from you a couple of things. So yes, I look forward to these discussions and I will try my best. You're muted. I can't hear you.
So sorry, ma'am. Ma'am,
Yes.
I would like to ask some of the like ground building for our audience, for our fellows. Like, what are the types of climate financial or international financial institutions that are working in climate finance, how are they working, what's their properly mechanism, and how they are usually tackling this solution, the thing for properly making the solutions in terms of climate finance, and how they are encouraging the developing nations to properly work with them. I just want you to please make some ground building for our audience, and then we'll move to the Q&As.
Okay, thank you for that. I think that's a very good background. I think for me, I don't, because I did environment as my undergrad. I'm doing environment policy as my master's, and hopefully moving onwards. And I don't look at climate finance in isolation, because the genesis of climate finance comes from environmental finance, which of course goes back to the Rio Earth Summit of 1992. So it is really important to understand what are some of the outcomes of the Rio Earth Summit. So the Rio Earth Summit was basically sitting down to discuss how development is impacting the environment, because the sad truth that we all have to accept, the activists, the environmentalists, is that there is no development anywhere that has not caused harm to the environment. So in Rio, of course, the international community met. That was in 1992, and Rio in 1992 set the baseline year for all environmental issues. So I'll not talk about the Rio outputs, Rio markers, but I'll focus on issues of environmental finance, because it trickles down to issues of climate finance. So climate change and the UNFCCC process was birthed during the Rio Earth Summit, along with CBD and UNCCD and the other conventions on other conventions of environment. So when you look at environmental finance in Rio Earth Summit, the initial agreement was 60% of the financing needed to address environmental concerns, basically, that had been caused by development, would be mobilized domestically at national level. So 60% was going to be mobilized at national level. And then 40% would be mobilized by the international community to co-finance. So the concept of co-financing was birthed in Rio Earth Summit, the 1992 Rio Earth Summit. So environmental finance, any environmental finance that is in line with the Rio Earth Summit, which is the genesis for all environmental issues, has the concept of co-financing. So you must mobilize 60% of what you need. Then the international community, of course, has to mobilize the other 40%. So now when we come to domestically, it means at national level, because I am hoping that you understand these conventions, it is membership by party 2. So it means you ratify and you become a party to certain conventions and all that. So when you look at this particular stage, we have agreed in Rio that domestically, countries would mobilize 60% of what they need. Then the 40%, of course, would be mobilized by the international community. So hence, the first entity was created. The International Environmental Agency was created. That's the GEF. The GEF, Global Environmental Facility. So the GEF was established basically as an entity that was going to provide environmental financing to countries, co-financing, not financing, not 100% co-financing. The agreement for Rio was, we're not going to give you the full amount. If you need 100 billion for a full project, you must, of course, already have 60. Then the GEF would give you the 40%, basically. And the GEF was meant to address biodiversity concerns, climate change concerns, all environmental concerns, every environmental concern. So today we have the GEF, which is the long-standing, and GEF supports a wide range. It supports the UNFCCC process, the CBD, plastics. It supports everything, because it is the first environmental institution, let me call it, financial institution. Then later on, when we went in 1995, we had, of course, the first meeting on climate change, COP1. That was in Berlin, I think, in Germany. And later on, we had a Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. So I'll not go deeper into Kyoto and the Paris Agreement, how we moved from Kyoto to Paris, but I'll touch on it. Maybe it touches a bit on question. We can talk about it later. So when you look at the Paris Agreement came with a dedicated financing entity for climate change called the GCF, Green Climate Fund. So the first one was GEF, Global Environmental Facility, that addresses all environmental concerns, basically. But now, for the first time, we're going to have one that focuses on climate change, the big one, the GEF. And then there's also the Adaptation Fund also. So there's the GEF, the GCF and the Adaptation Fund. So the GCF began in Cancun in 2010 and came operational, fully operational when we were going for the Paris Agreement, which of course is one of the huge milestone within these climate change discussions. And recently, of course, we've had, of course, the Loss and Damage Fund that, of course, is being established, basically. So these are international institutions, financial institutions. We call them financial mechanisms under the UNFCCC, or yes, so the GEF, the GCF, the Adaptation Fund, and of course, we've seen a new one that has come up, CIF, Climate Investment Fund, though it came a bit, looks more like the private sector. But other than that, of course, we look at this issue of when we came to issue of the Paris Agreement per se, it was more like a whole of society approach in terms of like every player was welcome to support climate action. So it wasn't heavily the responsibility of government alone to be able to address climate change, but also entities like banks, for example, the Africa Development Bank, has also some of its funds, such as the Africa Climate Change Fund. We have one in Asia. We have, of course, it's called EBDRC or something. So banks are also coming in to support because we need as much money, as much support. We need all hands on deck to be able to support. So we do have those, I call them MDBs, who have been instrumental in providing financing. But I think the key takeaway for this is which is a principle that we began with in Rio. Any issue of environmental finance or climate finance, whichever you call it, however you call it, it is based on co-financing. So anytime you're looking for climate financing that is mainstream through the financial mechanisms, which is aligned with, of course, the UN convention and all that, apart from the bilateral, it is going to be a co-financing mechanism. So when you're applying for the GEF, GEF sometimes has a bit of grants because GEF is a bit flexible, but when you're applying for the other funds, especially the GCF, which is the biggest fund basically on climate, the most famous fund, basically, you must already have some money. So it goes into co-financing. So I think I can stop there so that I don't eat up all the time on the opening. Yes. We can't hear you. Can I mute?
So sorry, ma'am. Thank you so much for the way and very well mannered how you explained the whole opening statement regarding the climate finance. And if we move forward towards the current status of climate finance, I wanted to ask, because we just had SB 64, and in that SB 64 we had the work program of climate finance. I attended the first workshop of climate finance work program, and I wanted to know from your behalf, like, what was the whole structure of climate finance in SB 64? How were the parties concerned? What was the status of developed countries? What was the status of developing countries? And also, what was the status of the blocks? For example, basic group, Arab group, or it could be any group, according to you, as you attended it in a very well mannered. Like we had also the stance of AGN, African Group of Negotiators.
Thank you for that. Before I delve deep into the outcomes of climate finance during the SB's 64. Sometimes it's good also to sometimes understand the UNFCCC, a bit of the UNFCCC processes. So we do have the COPs, of course, that originated from the Rio Art Summit. Then we have the SBs. The SBs are more like preparatory sessions towards the COP. So the main mandate or the main role of the SBs basically is to look at the previous outputs of COP, for example, what was agreed at COP, and to jumpstart work ahead of, what agenda item can be adopted going into when you're moving into the COP. So so looking at the outputs that we had in Belém per se, and looking at how are we going into Turkey. So that's usually the main goal of the SB's intercession. So looking at it, we basically had a lot of issues for the SBC 64. We had no agreement on issues around adaptation financing, and we know that adaptation is something that is very key for developing countries like Africa. So we didn't have as much progress as we had anticipated. So the developing countries, particularly Africa, was pushing for clear implementation of COP30 commitments to at least triple adaptation finance by 2035. We've seen that there's a lot of money that goes into mitigation compared to adaptation, which has been a concern, and we'll discuss this later potentially. So Africa has really been pushing, Africa and the rest of the developing countries pushing to have more financing to go on adaptation, more financing, triple, not just double, to triple the adaptation. So finance, of course, remain the biggest source of divisions. Of course, the main issue with climate finance stems from back when we started these discussions on climate finance. The issue is the definition of climate finance. What is climate finance ideally? Because climate finance is not defined. There is no universal international agreement of what climate finance is. So this one has become a challenge, has been discussed in the SCF forums, basically, and long-term financing. So there are two issues: definition of climate finance, because climate finance means different things to different people. And one of the ticking issues that has been there for all the years and continues to be there is the issue that, of course, everyone is defining finance the way they want it. And the challenge is the people who are supposed to give the money, the developed countries, they are counting development aid as part of climate financing, which should not be the case. Because ideally, this whole concept of climate change and the negotiations, it is supposed to be ideally separate, because it is money owed to the developing countries by the developed countries for, of course, the emissions, because we are the ones who are suffering more, and they are the ones who created this issue of climate change to begin with. But when you come to the negotiation room, they want to count the aid that they normally give, the development support, as part of climate financing. Another key teething issue has always been, continues to be, issue of long-term mobilization of climate finance. So many times they've been trying to put an end that when it gets to a certain year, we finish, mobilizing. We don't want to hear anything about climate financing. And it's become an issue that has been repeatedly over and over again, because it means that it looks like the developed nations are trying to get out of their commitments to provide financing, continuous mobilization of climate financing. Another issue, of course, we had little progress. We have the Baku to Belém roadmaps. So some countries continue discussions on implementing Baku to Belém roadmaps towards the 1.3 trillion annually for developing countries. So you know that the 100 billion, that was supposed to be by 2020. So it's more of a game of pushing the end line, like pushing the targets. Because initially we agreed in Paris that we'd have 100 million annually from 2020, then it was pushed to 2025, then it was met, and then it was somehow everyone had their own numbers, sort of, and of course, when everyone has their own numbers, sometimes tracking, how much, whether we've met the 100 billion. So it was met around 5 years late. So 5 years late, when it comes to developing countries context, it means that a lot of damage has already been done, basically, because when you look at even the IPCC reports, the longer you take to address climate change, the worse and more expensive things will become. So there's also adaptation negotiations were delayed because of finance. Africa argue that adaptation targets cannot be implemented without financing. So the issue is always about financing. But issue around financing for adaptation, if I may divulge a bit further into it, you'll find that most donors, they prefer, most people are giving the financing, they prefer to sponsor mitigation compared to adaptation. Why is that? They prefer to do this because mitigation is easier to quantify compared to adaptation, because adaptation is like it's like intangible, like making a community feel better. You understand? Like, how do you measure resilience? How do you measure that I have adapted? You understand? How do you measure, food security is here, no there. But when it comes to mitigation, you can say, for example, because at the end of the day, everything has to align with the person who's giving the money, their key performance indicators, their KPIs, whoever is giving the money. So the person who's giving the money, remember, is not a negotiator on climate change, is not an environmentalist, is a finance person who probably knows nothing about the environment. So they need to justify from wherever they get this money and say mitigation is easier for them because they can say we supported 50,000 cook stoves, compared to adaptation, which is very hard to quantify. And then the other thing for adaptation, there's a lot of opportunities for return on investment when you look at mitigation compared to adaptation. It is easier to have a return on investment. So adaptation tends to attract a lot of these financial institutions. So adaptation is a bit lagging behind, but there's a bit of hope for adaptation. But it's just a general concept that most of these donors, they prefer mitigation because there's something they're going to say they have supported this easier to quantify compared to adaptation. So the general issue is that the issue of access to climate financing, improving access to climate financing. So look at issues of climate finance. There's availability and access to climate financing. Those are the two teething issues. So availability is the 100 billion is in the GCF kitty, but accessing it becomes a challenge because you'll find that, for example, the GCF processes, though they're trying to streamline, initially it used to take around 3 years. If you apply for GCF today, first of all, you must already have the co-financing, of course, 60% of your project, then ask for the other 40% so that you have the co-financing. So it means that you when you already have this money, you start applying today. Today is we're in 2026. The earliest you'd get this money is in 3 years, 2029. Ideal. So if it was a project that needed urgent action and you needed that co-financing from GCF, it wouldn't really per se make sense. And GCF has been packaged as this giant fund, basically for giant organizations. A key case for Kenya, though we may not be the best example, GCF is not per se accessible to small entities. GCF, the first GCF was by IUCN, which when you look at IUCN, they're my friends, so I hope they won't take this negative if they see this. IUCN is a global entity with a lot of already resources, a lot of deep pockets. So look at local organizations. You can't compete with IUCN to access, GCF money, because they already have money to access the money. And the sad reality that we must accept, which is one of the issues that continue to be a challenge in climate finance room, the sad reality is that most of this climate financing, apart from adaptation fund, which is trying, is loans. So how are you going to pay back this loan? Most of this money is loan. So the issue of loan versus grant, and in as much as we keep on celebrating, we've gotten this amount of money, like Kenya, for example, has gotten money from World Bank called FLOCA, Financing Locally Led Climate Action. And it's going to the communities, it's going, to the grassroots. We have the communities sitting in committees and deciding which projects to be implemented. But at the end of the day, this money is not a grant, it is a loan, basically, which is a loan that has been taken against the Kenya government. And it means that Kenyan citizens, myself and my children are going to be paying for this money. So looking at issue of sustainability of this particular issue. So I've just touched a bit of that, and maybe we can continue even as we go into the conversations. But yeah, that's just a bit of summation of some of the outputs at SB 64.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your kind contributions. And you were right, like we are moving towards the 1.5 trillion that we planned, and let's really hope for the very best. And so, ma'am, let's just move forward to the phase where I will be asking my 4 questions from you, the 4 technical questions. So my very first question will revolve around the commitment of $100 billion. So we know that the international financial institutions, they committed that they will give $100 billion annually to climate finance in order to properly reduce the global emissions as they are continuing to rise and climate impacts are accelerating. So, how do you reconcile the massive scale of climate finance mobilization with the apparent failure to achieve transformational climate outcomes? And is the problem fundamentally about the quantum of finance, the allocation mechanisms, or the underlying economic model that in which the international financial institutions are operating within?
Uh, Thank you for that. I think that's a very excellent question, and it's like a three-part question, the way I understand it. Uh, so, uh, like I was saying, ideally, we need to understand that when we started in Rio, there's a reason why it's called the Conference of Parties. Parties, it means government, ideally. So ideally, most of the people who get the first hand, not the only people who get the first hand access to financing and all this is government. So when the international financial institution is going to negotiate for climate action, for to going to provide this support, it is going to support it is going to negotiate with the government of the particular country, ideally. So the international finance institution will negotiate with, for example, the government of Kenya. And what they usually happens, because I've done a bit of research with AfDB, they have, so for example, country profile, basically. Each year, after every 5 years, I think they develop a strategic plan with the country and everything that they want to do. Then they look at the component for climate change. So everything is backed against, how do you say, country profile. But back to, of course, some bit of your question that you mentioned, basically, why is money being put and we don't see tangible outputs? So outputs, we can look at it in two terms. Look at adaptation outputs and mitigation outputs, basically. So adaptation, I'll start with adaptation because I'm very passionate about adaptation. Adaptation has a bit of issues that I tried to explain. The challenge with adaptation is quantification. How do we quantify adaptation outputs? Basically, that is where the road meets the rubber. When you look at mitigation, compare adaptation and mitigation. Mitigation, you can say we have invested, let's say, 50,000 cook stoves or something, and it has reduced emissions by this quantity, and this one has been able to evolve into Article 6.2, which is discussions around carbon markets. And we can see how even there is a bit of return on investment when you look at mitigation, linking it to issues of carbon markets. Like, for example, currently we are running a project on clean cooking for schools and carbon financing. So looking at how we invest, if an investor, it is more attractive to go to an investor. We want to support 1,000 schools in Kenya to transition with this technology, which is going to reduce carbon emissions or deforestation by X amount, which is we can quantify and we can sell it, because there's that issue of return on investment. So the sad reality is there's more financing in private sector than in, the philanthropic sector. So it's like there's more interest in the private sector more than, the environmentalists, and we want to do good for the, for the environment. For lack of a better term, there is a very little environmental integrity when it comes to issues around where money goes into. It's all about what are we going to get a return on investment. That's why you'll find, like today, Kenya, we have, I think, the second bank has been accredited. We have the Kenya Commercial Bank accredited to the Green Climate Fund. And there's also the Equity Bank has recently been accredited to the Green Climate Fund. Why? Because there's money in the private sector. And you go to the bank is about business, return on investment. When you look at entities, easier for mitigation, for example, clean cooking, because we have indicators, we can measure it against the it can link it to the global temperatures, the global emissions, the country NDC. You see how there's things that you could easily measure this against. But when you come to adaptation, this is where things start getting a bit tricky. So how are you going to justify resilience, basically, in terms of numbers? This community has been made. The issue of and quantification goes up, not just at the grassroots level, even at the national level and at the global level, which is where the GGA is stuck, the global goal and adaptation. So when we were starting this issue of climate change and the Paris Agreement, it focused more on the mitigation side of it. The NDC, it was more focused towards mitigation rather than adaptation, because quantification. So the GGA ideally was supposed to give us indicators, basically, on what can be measurable so that, investors can come in basically. But in a nutshell, mitigation tends to be more attractive because, things are in place, things are in line, you have people working on this, you're working towards a specific target, and there is that aspect of carbon financing. The truth of the matter is, which is sad to say, no one really wants to give you money. No one wants to do something apart from the activists and those who care about the environment, because no one has money to put into something that is not going to give them something in return. People want something to give in return. So when you look at issues of Article 6.2, Article 6.2 right now is looking like the future of more per se, a source of financing for this issue of climate finance, Article 6 per se, because when you look at Article 6, there's trade, there's sale of carbon credits. You understand? So a project sell and generate. So in as much as environmental integrity might not be really firm per se in Article 6, but there is more investment and focus there because of that aspect of return on investment. People want to do business. That's the sad reality of it. Looking at adaptation, how do you do business with adaptation? You're doing it so that what happens? Like for Kenya, we are having a project where we're looking at, for example, you can develop a project that has an adaptation project that has mitigation co-benefits and vice versa. We have a project on clean cooking that is looking to sell carbon credits. Then the money is reinvested back into the school feeding program. So there's a bit of, you get something out of it. So when you go to any donor or anyone, someone out of there, it is more attractive usually when you go to someone and tell them what they're getting in return. For example, like right now, it's easier for Kenya because we have an agreement, I think, with Sweden and Switzerland. It's easier for Kenya to go to Switzerland and say, give us this money, we invest in carbon markets, and then you get the carbon credits. There's something they're getting in return. But adaptation, what really are you getting in return? So it becomes a bit tricky. So a lot of the money is going ideally into, how do I say, mitigation focused sector, which is more aligned within the private sector and the business community, who might not ideally have the interest, the environmental, might not have firm environmental integrity at heart. Because when you look at people like banks, their main work is to make money. And then issues of environment is more like a CSR. It's like a company. Look at how a company works. A company and an NGO, those are two different entities. A company will do so many things, then they'll think about environment as part of their corporate social responsibility, something they're giving back to. It's not their main focus. So a lot of money is going to people who have that sort of mindset and framing. So you'll not see as much. But also other than that, because I think this is a very heavy question, when we started this discussion on climate change and environmental action, basically, climate change and climate action is not supposed to stop developing countries from realizing their development agenda, ideally. So the issue why it was called the Rio Earth Conference, it was how development is impacting the environment. Ideally, environmentalists and development practitioners have always been, head to head, because, the people who are focused towards development are impacting on the environment and vice versa. But when you look at countries at the end of the day, people have to make decisions. That's why it's a party-driven process. You have to make decisions based on your national circumstance. So it means that if, for example, let me give a very small example. A country can have two options. Do I conserve this forest and for the sake of environment, or my country is overpopulated, I need to build a hospital in this forest to provide services. So that is something that the government has to weigh, has to balance, which brings in the issue of sustainable development. So at the end of the day, this is a party-driven process. The Minister for Environment might be an environmentalist or not, but everything, the country is headed by a president who has to make decision, not based on, he's not the president for environment, sorry to say, the president of a country, of a party. He has to make decisions, parliament has to make decisions that are sustainable. So issues of climate change should not hinder, it's not supposed to bar countries from realizing their development agenda, basically. So countries have to continue feeding themselves, providing for their citizens, despite, trying to balance. So that issue of balancing issues of development and issues of environment, which of course brings in the concept of the green growth or green economy movement. So how can we, how do I say, develop in a manner that is, less detrimental to the environment? Because at the end of the day, like I said, opening this particular discussion, every development that has ever taken place, is ever going to take place, is going to have an impact on the environment. That's why we have the environmental, social impact assessment and the safeguard. Every one of them is going to affect the environment. But we can look at the best, the one that has the least, effect, the least of the worst effect to the environment. So at the end of the day, it is not a question of money has been put here and it's not. The countries have a right to develop. That's why you hear a lot of South Africa, which of course is driving a lot of the voice in the climate finance negotiation room, talking about stranded assets, because it's a decision of, for example, a country X, I will not mention names, has an oil, basically has some oil in their country, and you're saying face fossil fuels. But me as a president, I'm looking at it from, I need this oil basically so that I get money, so that I pay the debt, so that I improve the lives of my people. So which one do I pick? It has to be a balance. Environmental conservation, I leave this oil on the ground the way it is, or I take this oil, I support my country, then look at avenues of how to better support the environment. So it's a very touchy topic, especially when you talk to Middle East countries, for example. It's a very touchy topic, because when you talk about, sorry, I'm jumping too much, you talk about phasing out, for example, investing in cleaner technologies, but your main source of revenue, for example, is oil. So it means that now your economy stops. So that for the environment, it's not really feasible, because a country should not be able to choose. We should not choose, for example, education and climate change. It should not get to that particular extent. Basically, climate change is important, so is education, and they're interlinked. Let's not choose between health and education, infrastructure and climate change. We have to find a middle ground where education exists and climate change exists. But where we are right now, most countries are looking at how is my education and health above, then climate change is coming way, just below it, because the country has to run. The country has to run. Because you can, at the end of the day, even you, when you look at it from an individual perspective, if you do not have money, for example, to feed yourself in the campus, then definitely you don't have money to take to pay transport to go to a climate march. You understand? So you need to have fed yourself first, is when you can engage in this. That's just some of the mathematics that countries have to be faced with. That's why it's a country-driven process in all this. I hope I tried to touch on some of the issues around it. Yes.
Thank you so much, ma'am. You have touched all the issues regarding mitigation and adaptation as well. So, ma'am, if we move towards my another question, I have that international financial institutions, they are simultaneously tasked with supporting climate mitigation, the phasing out of fossil fuels, and facilitating the development in low-income countries where energy poverty remains rampant. So, how do you ethically justify potentially constraining energy access and economic development for countries that are trying to lift populations out of poverty in the name of climate goals that were primarily created by high emission developed nations? Like, isn't this a form of climate colonialism?
That's a very interesting outlook of it. The good thing about the topic of climate finance, it's linked. Climate finance is a means of implementation. So most of the time, it's going to cut across most of the sectors. So ideally, that question is dancing around the concept of just transition. We have the UAE dialogue on just transition. How are we going to basically transit into that? I don't think per se it's an issue of colonialism. From where I sit, I think it's an issue of interest. It's all about interest and return on investment. Interest in terms of a country like my country currently, as we speak, it's a very good example. Kenya has a lot of debt to the banks, the international community, especially the banks. These are the same lenders. World Bank is the same person. Debts that are not related to issues of, climate change. And when you look at when the FDB sits down, for example, or the World Bank or the financial institution sits down, basically, we need a middle ground where an avenue where there can be that, for lack of better term, profit making, or how do I be? They put in a very fancy way, sustainability in terms of your availability to pay back. Understand? So adaptation per se does not give not sustainability in the environmental sense, financial sustainability in terms of most of this money, like I said, it is loans, not grants. Most of this money is loans. And loans, you're looking at how are you going to be able to pay it back, because most of these financial, they're focused on return on investment. So it's not more about colonialism, but it is more so linked to the debt structure that most developing countries are at. So a lot of developing countries in Africa, they have a lot of debt, basically, and we pay, but we keep on borrowing and borrowing, not just for climate change, but for other avenues, basically. So the whole economic architecture, let me call it that, of most of these developing countries is the issue, because you already have debt, and also, on top of that, the money for climate finance is more debt, basically. And at the end of the day, like I said, this is the sad reality. No one wants to give you money for free. Very small portion, very small projects are focused on adaptation, because even them, they get the money from somewhere. Everyone is borrowing money from somewhere. No one is going to give you money for free. So it's less about colonialism, but it's more about the way most of these countries, developing countries, are economically, their structures are, they're full of debt, the economic structures of countries, and they owe these same financial institutions that are going to give them money. So mitigation comes easy for them, because mitigation is there's basically that potential of return on investment. Basically, it's easier for them to quantify rather than adaptation. Though I believe that adaptation should be a priority, because it's the priority for developing countries. But when you come to the economics and financing, people are going for mitigation, because there's that return on investment you can justify linked to the GGA. There's no indicators. How are you going to quantify the fact that a child has not slept hungry? You've reduced hunger index. How are you going to measure hunger? For example, you've reduced hunger. There's that hunger index, but still, how are you going to measure making someone's life better, which ideally should be the focus of environmental conservation. But when you talk to these financial institutions, they are not environmentalists. They are money people. They're finance people. So most of the time, it's all about, how are they going to report? They want to report numbers and figures. We supported 80,000, 60,000. So mitigation is easier to quantify. I think that's the answer of it. And also the African, not just Africa, I think most of the developing countries, they have so much debt already, aside from climate change, that is already there in this particular country. So the financial architecture is, but also I believe also when you look at the economic architecture of most of these African countries, not just Africa, but Africa is one of the biggest culprits. It's also issue of governance and politics and government of the day, because you'll find that a lot of these countries, some of them, they have a lot of assets that they could, if used in the right way, could be able to get them out of that debt situation. But you'll find that they mismanage their assets, or a lot of corruption. So issues around structures, institutional frameworks within these African countries, also tend to contribute to some of these issues. Yes.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for the whole explanation for the answer regarding the simultaneously tasking of IFIs in the supporting of climate mitigation. So, ma'am, with that being said, let's just move towards because you have mostly mentioned about the adaptation financing. So, I have a question regarding the adaptation financing. That adaptation financing remains severely underfunded. Like, for example, it was said like around 20% of the total climate finance is being underfunded in adaptation financing, and despite being equally critical to survival, particularly for the vulnerable nations. And given this thing, the developed nations have historically caused more atmospheric carbon, while developing nations face the worst impacts. So, shouldn't the international financial institutes be legally mandated to guarantee a minimum percentage of climate finance to adaptation? And more fundamentally, who is accountable, who is responsible when adaptation projects fail to prevent climate change or climate damage?
Mm, 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 mm. I'll start with the last question, moving up ideally. So this issue of climate change we're gone to the ICC, I think International Criminal Court, and that discussion of whose responsibility it is, though we know it is the responsibility of those who created this climate change, this climate change issue, those who emitted potentially, but at the end of the day, uh, the person responsible for issues of climate change is not ideally the financial institutions, though they should be mandated to. It is the countries themselves. Because when you look at the Industrial Revolution, it was not a bank that was doing it, it was countries that were doing it. It was Germany and all the other countries with their coal and everything of theirs. They are the ones who are mandated to do that. What financial institutions, they might be backed by this, they're the ones backing these countries, or they're the ones that these countries put money into to support us, but they're more like a middle entity per se, because it's basically like a three-part story where there are three people. We have the developed countries who are the cause of climate change. We have the developing countries who are the most impacted. Then we have this middle person called the financial institution. The financial institution, what happens with the financial institution? The head of the financial institution per se is not, the person who is responsible for climate change. It's just a person who was employed to fulfill that particular mandate. So what happens is, like currently for GCF, the head of the GCF is Mafalda. I'm not sure she's from the developing country. Tomorrow you can be, or I can be, the head of the GCF. So there is no per se legal mandate, per se, like something tying them that they have to do this. What happens with, aside from the banks, basically, what happens with the GCF, the Jeff Adaptation Fund, and of course the upcoming Loss and Damage Fund, because they were funds that are financial mechanisms serving the convention, serving the Paris Agreement. They every day they have to give a report to the Conference of Parties. They have to give a report to the parties, basically. So the parties is where the COPs and the SBs, basically. And the parties have to give them direction, ideally. So if we wanted a direction that, for example, like you said, you should fund 80% of your money should go to adaptation. This decision, instruction, it is an independent body that takes instructions from COP, Conference of Parties, basically. The instruction has to come from, this co-president, co-processes a report, guidance. So there's usually something like report to the COP, guidance to Understand? So you give them report because they are serving your issue. But this is where the road meets the rubber. Your idea is very good and very fantastic. They should be mandated to do X, Y, and Z. But this is where negotiations, this is where the road meets the rubber. Because the UNFCCC is a party-driven process. So the COP is a party-driven process. So what happens is, for that decision to be made, ideally, it means that Kenya and Africa have to sit on a table here. Then the next person is, for example, EU. The negotiators who are representing countries, parties, have to sit and say, for example, a country like, I think you're from India or somewhere around, India has to come out and say that 80% of money in the GCF should go to adaptation. That is what, we want. But for it to be a consensus decision of the COP, it must be agreed by EU and Sweden and all of that. So if EU says no, it is not going anywhere. So that is why such decisions, more often than not, they lead to Rule 16, basically. But before we get to Rule 16, we have levels even in the negotiations. So such ideas are very fantastic. You could have that it has to come from a party, because a party-driven process. You could go to the government of India. In Kenya, we have the country position before we go to COPs and the SBs. Then you say, our position for this, we want 80%. You could actually tell your government you want 80% of money in GCF to go to adaptation. You could do that, and India will come to the COPs and the SBs and say, us as India, we want this. And Africa can support. That's why there is usually that alignment. Africa can support G77. But of course, most of the time, these people who give out this money, who are responsible, EU, US, and the rest of the big boys, I call them the big boys, will not agree. So if you don't have an agreement, this is the first layer of disagreement, because they will not agree, because they want something that they get something in return. The whole concept, which is so, lack of better term, might not be the most comfortable language to use. It's like they're giving you money so that they come to your country and follow it. They follow their money back. So it's like they're saying, we want to give money to the GCF or something of the sort. Then they give that money there. But then the company who's doing the consultancy in India or in Pakistan or in Kenya is from their country. So you're going to pay them to do money that is supposed to, they're following their money back home. For example, we had, lack of better term, Cocoa Networks. Cocoa Networks was doing a lot of clean cooking work for households, but Cocoa Network is not from Africa, is not from Kenya. It's from, their particular side of the world, or they'll force you to invest in their technology. So everyone is looking at what is it in it for me. So it's not even about environmental integrity. So at that negotiation level, they have been given instructions to not allow, I'm not saying that to not allow such discussions to pass through. And within the core processes, if one country disagrees, that is the end of it. We cannot proceed. So if at the negotiation level you can't agree, it goes to, of course, the heads of delegation. And if, India, who was the proponent of this particular agenda of 80% of GCF going to adaptation, if India is the main proponent, then the head of delegation is called. If your head is also firm on this particular agenda, basically, then it goes up to the minister and goes up to the presidency. And if we can't solve it, it becomes Rule 16 and we can't agree on it. It's the same way we have been trying in the negotiation rooms to give a definition of climate financing and saying it doesn't end. And each time we get to that end, we close it. Is the same way in Article 6. They're saying when Article 6.2 will become operational, then they'll return the money back to adaptation fund. You understand? So they're borrowing from the adaptation fund to give to Article 6.2 in, Article 6.2 until it becomes operational. But what happens in the negotiation room, this is the tricks. People want to back out. So you've given money into Article 6.2, whatever it is. You're supposed to give back when it becomes self-financing, not operation. When it comes self-financing, we will get to because everything has to be made at the negotiation table. They will say it has not become self-financing. So self-financing becomes ambiguous because everyone can define self-financing in their own terms, and that one comes an issue of Rule 13, and we can't move, and they block it. So most of these financial institutions, the people who are funding them, they are backed by, lack of better time, countries that have economic muscles, economic muscles that the developing countries don't have, and everyone is pushing for their agenda, their business, what is going to be important for them. Everyone is coming from, that's why they call it national priorities, national agenda. So their national agenda is not to help you to address climate change, is to purport to help you to address climate change in a manner that they are the biggest beneficiary at the end of the day. So it's a possibility to have, guidance. It could work where if countries could agree in an ideal where they have guidance to the GCF to be able to 80% of GCF money to go to adaptation. Basically, it's very possible to propose that and have it in the text, and then the COP decision, then it's adopted, and then GCF would have to, because GCF is more per se at the mercy of the countries of the COP. And they have also their governing instruments, but the government is aligned to the COP. They come and report, this is what we've done. But we've seen a bit of lobby that has been there in the past, caused a lot of noise, and they have increased the number of projects, but not as significant as we want. The number of projects for adaptation, especially for the GCF, number of projects for adaptation approved by the GCF board and everything. So everything comes down to the negotiation table, because the people who are giving the money, the person who's giving the money is looking for return on investment. That's why you'll hear they're saying, financial entities are looking at financing mitigation, not adaptation, because it is their interest. Mitigation is in their interest, because at the end of the day, they say new mitigation because they're the ones, they're making business for themselves. They're the ones with the solutions, and they're going to say technology transfer. You're going to buy that technology from them. So they're giving you money, putting in this institution, then they say invest in clean technology. And in Africa or developing world, we have not developed our manufacturing and technology center. We have not have our innovation to that level. They're far ahead. They're going to manufacture it. They can't companies in wherever it is, in China or in Europe, and they're going to sell you. So this money that they've given you, they're taking it back again. So it's all interlinked, though ideally, yeah, banks could do that. But I've seen some banks, of course, being able to invest in adaptation, like I think Adaptation Accelerator Program, I think with the AfDB has done a lot of work. I know a lot of work in Africa has been done on adaptation and projects, but at the end of even those projects, when you look at those projects that are being funded, they are more like agribusiness, business-oriented, return on investment. When you look at the climate innovation centers, they're looking at the business aspect. I actually had a sister who won some money, and then after she won the money, she was told, for you to receive the money, now you must move from an NGO into a company, because it's all about business, return on investment. So everyone is looking for return on investment. And the people who are giving the money, they're the developed countries, and they're going to finance whatever they want. So if you don't align, you don't get the money. The issue of access still remains a challenge. So even when you go to the negotiating table, they have their own interest, and they're given instructions, don't allow. Such could be good. Even at the regional level, your regional bank, if you have meetings, you could table some of these things, in those interactive sessions. We want you to finance this more. When you have I think recently had the Jeff meeting in June. I think during the SBs, Jeff was meeting in Uzbekistan, I think. It could be good to table some of those things in those particular forums. And if you're lucky, some will be taken up, depending on, the governance and the leadership and the interest. But at the end of the day, these financial institutions, who is funding them, they put with the money, and they have interest in adaptation. And in mitigation, adaptation is only interest for those who are suffering, which is Africa and the rest of the developing world. Yes, that's the unfortunate news.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And the way that you were explaining, I just got reminded by the book's name. There was a book that was written by an American author. His name was John Perkins, and he wrote the book of The Confessions of an Economic Hitman. And the way that you explained, for example, that developed countries will invest in your country and they will ask you to properly give, like, your company will not be investing in your own country. We will be providing you with our workers to properly complete your projects.
Mhm.
The same was written in that book, and I just got reminded by that the whole scenario that happened, and that was well explained by Mr. John. So, ma'am, with that being said, let's just move towards my last question, and then we'll be moving towards the Q&As from our fellows. Uh, so, ma'am, my question is: the international financial institutes, they are increasingly emphasizing on mobilizing the private capital through blended finance and de-risking the mechanisms. So, however, this often means that public money subsidizes the private profit, taking on the lower risk projects, while truly innovative high risk climate solutions remain unfunded. So, isn't this model essentially transferring the public resources to private actors while claiming to leverage the finance? And doesn't this undermine the original mandate of development banks to fill market gaps rather than entering the competitive markets?
Uh, Thank you for that. I think that's a very good question. So it's like public money is being taken to the private sector to be able to advance an agenda or two. Uh, I think it's I'd started. There's actually a movement going around Africa. It's a proposal concept about the financial architecture. Ideally, the financial architecture being the root cause of some of these issues, including access to climate finance and issues conversion about around blended finance and whatnot. Uh, I'm going to give a good example, a casing example, basically. Uh, I have worked on a project funded by AfDB and the World Bank, and like I said, like I was saying, each of these development MDBs or financial institutions, some of them have what we call the country priorities, like FDB has for Africa, for every country, what they're looking to work on with them, and all that and all that. So most of the time, uh, they are looking how they engage with government as aside from climate change is that government has to put in X amount of money is when they invest, because uh, it's more of, I feel from my perspective, it's more of a mistrust issue, because some people feel like, even no, not just that, even with the small innovations that are being supported, if you're given something, people have this perception that if you're given something for free, you understand, at a free cost, there's a tendency not to value it, to misuse it, to undermine it. So the same applies to how these financial institutions operate. They can say they're coming to build a road in Kenya for 80 billion, but for them they need to see your commitment. So you need to put in your money so that the bank is, the financial institution is comfortable putting in their money. So you put in that country's money, that public, which is public finance money, it is put in there, is when they bring in there, so that they know that it is not like a sinking ship or you won't misappropriate the money. So the whole question around it, it's about the architect, the financial architecture, especially for developing countries. Most of this arrangement are structured in such a way that if you don't put in your money, they will not. That's why most of the time when they're giving you money for a project, a huge money for a project has to go through the treasury. So it's a loan, but you have to put in, if you've made an FTB application or something, you must put in your money first. So if it's 80 billion they're giving you, they must see government has put, for example, 15 billion on it. So that's how their architecture is structured. And even in this 80 billion, it's still part of, a loan grant. So for them, it's basically an issue of the financial architecture. That's how it's structured. they will not give you money, especially because they give money to governments. They'll not give you money if you've not put in your own money, unless for very few circumstances in terms of grants and all that. Very, very few of them. But for the one that you don't put in any money, it's usually a very small portion of it. But you have to put in your money, or they will not. Even for GCF, the government has to put in money to government has to put in money, then the IUCN or whoever the co-financial implementing entity has to put in money, is when GCF put in money. So it's a whole issue of financial architecture and mistrust, and that one cannot change ideally. So the same architecture that has been there being used for years, aside from climate change, is the same financial architecture that is going to apply to issues of climate financing. That's why in my country we have what we call the Public Finance Management Act, PFMA, Public Finance Management Act, basically. So it basically highlights how you're supposed to be engaging in most of this process. So you have to put in your money. Like for us, we are having a project on clean cooking for schools. So the government, is the one who is has to put in money before the financial institution. So it's not even an issue of climate change. It's an issue of financial architecture as a total. So they will not put in any money if your government has not put in money. That's just the whole summary of it. So if you could change that architecture of mistrust, and where they could ideally just give you money without you putting in money, but then also you have, for lack of better terms, I'm not accusing countries, but we've seen a lot of cases of corruption where funds are being misappropriated. There's a lot of weak institutional frameworks around most of these developing countries, because if you as a country already are at a certain level of corruption, let me say, you are categorized in terms of risks, basically high risk, low risk, medium risk. So also some of these things are also blamed on how your country behaves, your country's governance systems and governance structures. Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for once again detailing the whole answer. And now my questions are finished, and let's just move towards the questions from our fellows. So, fellows, if you have any question, you may please raise your hand. You may introduce yourself, and then you may ask your question from ma'am, or just you can simply write in the chat box regarding your question on the role of international financial institutions in climate finance. And you can also ask how the whole negotiations can be played regarding climate finance in the international forums, because you can gain all the knowledge regarding negotiations from ma'am. She's right here with us, and you may ask. Just raise your hand, or just you can simply type in the chat box.
As we wait for more for the questions from the audience, I just want to highlight how there's because of course some of these issues, the financial architecture, how issues negotiations on climate financing, of course, across all rooms. So climate financing is a cross-cutting issue. So you'll find in every agenda item, finance is linked. So any text or paragraph on finance is usually blocked, basically. And they say this should be discussed in the finance room, basically. So you'll find that an avenue, which I am not proposing, an avenue that people are now being attracted to are looking at issues around Article 6, and particularly the 6.4, the PACM, and also the Article 6.2 on ITMOS. So ITMOS, it's more like a more flexible sort of financial architecture access in terms of, in terms of, seeing a question basically in terms of it can generate some money without all these other complications. It's more around a bilateral, one country to the other country, and then we talk, and then we have a discussion, and then money is unlocked, and we move forward, and we just report. It's more easier compared to this usual normal architecture, financial instruments. Yeah, I've seen a question there.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And there is a question from Miss Bisma Vakas, and she's asking, do you think that the challenges that are being faced by the adaptation will also be faced by the loss and damage fund?
That's a very interesting question. Potentially, I do think that one, because a loss and damage is like the extreme end of adaptation, what you can't adapt to. Uh, though there's a lot of hype, so sometimes I think noise also helps. When we make a lot of noise, there's a lot of noise and hype around the loss and damage fund. Uh, there is potential that, of course, it's going to face similar challenges, and we really have to see, because most of what we've seen currently are just pledges for support to the loss and damage fund, and it might face the same challenges, but it might be a bit better off. I feel like it might be a bit better off compared to adoption fund, because it's like on the extreme end. So it will attempt, because I feel like loss and damage will have a bit of quantifiers in terms of the economic and non-economic losses. For example, giving a case for Africa, for like a pastoral community or the arid communities, loss and damage would be like economic in terms of your business was lost, or something along the line, and it is easier to quantify how many herds of cattle were lost. You understand? So adoption might have an upper hand compared to loss and damage. Will have an upper hand compared to adoption. Adoption is something that it's not yet in the extreme in terms of now the non-economic, the number of lives that were lost, and for the economic, how much business was lost. So it will be easier. It will have a much upper hand, and it might even support adoption in the process, because if we could already anticipate that some of these effects and challenges that are a result of loss and damage could be addressed through adaptation, so it might give adaptation a bit of boost, and give basically give a strong case why, if you don't give money into adaptation, you will pay more in loss and damages. So adaptation will have an upper hand. It might face similar, but it will most definitely have an upper hand, and it will bring that urgency, the much needed urgency, to address issues of climate change and unlock more of the financing. So it might, I feel like it's going to have a more upper hand than the adaptation. Yeah, there's another question.
Yes, Ms. Manahil, over to you. You may ask your question from me. Manahil, you have not turned on your mic.
Okay, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, good evening, ma'am. So I, first of all, thank you so much for delivering such an insightful session with us today. So I have written down my question. It's a bit long, but please bear with me. I would like to ask you that climate finance, it is often measured by how much money is committed rather than by the resilience it actually creates. So in your view, what metrics should international financial institutions use to judge success so that funding translates into meaningful improvements for vulnerable communities rather than simply meeting financial target? Over to you.
Thank you. That's a very excellent question. Issue about issue about financing, meeting targets, and all that. It's not even there's even a great underlying issues in terms of tracking the amount of money that goes into climate financing. At national level, I think we do have in Kenya, we have a tracking system for issues for budgeting and coding of money, every money that goes into climate financing. At global level, we have CPI, that's Climate Policy Initiative, that does a bit of tracking landscape of climate finance in Kenya. I know that the Standing Committee on Finance usually gives reports, but they're also tracking, more like tracking, and rather than the outputs and the impact, and that the money has been able to achieve. We do have a gap there as international level, national level, because we are focused more on, like you said, like we're not focused on the impact that have been there. I believe that it should first of all be measured in terms of emissions, first of all, because everything was created from these emissions. How much emissions have gone down in terms of how much carbon emissions, global carbon emissions, how it has gone down, the temperature goal, and also I feel like it's closely linked to the GGA indicators, global goal adoption indicators like resilience and well-being. So those are some of the indicators that should be matched in terms of how potentially the resources that have gone into climate finance have addressed climate change as a barrier, not just in the economic for not just to meet targets, but also in the economic and social aspects. So social in terms of well-being, access to food, access to amenities, how it has effectively addressed, looking at those social indicators. So we do need the mitigation. Mitigation is key in terms of emissions, looking at how countries have, how whatever you're doing has reduced emissions, how it has reduced the global temperatures, because there are people whose countries are about to be submerged. So it should look at that. So emissions, the temperature, but also the GGA indicators, global goal and adaptation, and also the economic and social indicators. Especially the social indicators, I think they are really critical, because the social indicators is what will bring about articulating the component of resilience and adaptation and enhancing the well-being of people vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, which I think we are not doing. And CPI is not doing that, because they're just tracking where has this money gone to, but we're not looking at, how impactful has this money been. So I think that's a gap that really needs to be addressed. It's a very excellent question, but it needs to look at the social, especially the social aspect, because the social will bring out the impact of it. So if you could be able to measure those social indicators aside from the GGA and all that, then that one would really be a win in my perspective here.
There is also a hand raised by Mr. Abdulhanan. Abdulhanan, over to you. Hanan, you have not turned on your mic. Please turn on your mic so that man can hear your question.
Am I audible now?
Yeah, you are audible.
Am I audible now? Myself, Abdullah, and first of all, ma'am, thank you for explaining everything so well. So my question is, keeping all these things in view, like according to your research, what practical strategies can be adopted so that like issues related to climate finance and climate change like reach every individual and are considered a serious matter?
I think from a practical perspective, I think the model that we are working on, I don't need to brag, we have a model. It's called the Flocker model, which is focused on looks like the locally led adoption structure, where when you have the Flocker level, we have the international architecture, then we have what we call the National Climate Change Fund, which of course has a bit of issues. Then we have the sub-governments, we call them county governments. We have 47 counties, and each county has a county climate change fund, but it doesn't end there. We have devolved further. Now we have what we call the ward adaptation committees. And the ward level is like the basic, it's like after the village, the way you have a village. So we have a committee of people who are able to identify projects at the community level in their local language, basically they don't have to speak English, write very bulky proposal, and all those things. Money has been brought to the grassroots, so at the community they identify their projects, which projects they want to help them to adapt. I think my main issue with the Flocker project is that it needs more of the experts, because in as much as we have the community, what the community vision, let me say, for climate change and the community at heart, we also need the technical expertise, because some of these interventions proposed by the community might not be as educated as the experts. So we need experts attached to these, committees at the gross level, so that to make sure that the solutions that are being proposed by these world committees, they are practical, they are sensible, they're aligned with environmental sustainability. So my main issue with this Flocker, I think Flocker is a very good project. You can Google about it. It's by World Bank. My main issue with the Flocker project is it's a loan and not a grant. That's the first issue that I have with it, because no one should be given, a loan, to adapt to climate change. And then the issue is the lack of attaching technical experts to the community committees. So for me, that locally centered approach, so that we decentralize this issue of climate financing, because it feels like this whole jargon of climate finance is at a very high and top tier level, where we have, this very technical terms, but, the impact on the impacts of climate change is felt at the grass. So there's a gap. There's climate finance in these negotiations and high level, and the community is down here. And this is where, I feel like it's more like a cooking pot, a pot in the oven or in the fire, and the community is the one at the base. So they're the ones who are really feeling the heat from the fire on the ground. So they're the ones feeling the impacts of climate change. So for me, that Flocker project model is a good model, where we have local communities. Money goes directly to the local communities, because all this, architecture, the structures, there's a lot of institutional gaps. There's corruption, money being lost along the way, misappropriated, and all that. So locally led approach with the community attached to experts at the local level, I think that is the silver bullet for me in terms of accessing financing. So if you can find more avenues of getting that money from the global level and bringing it down directly, without all these structures and architecture, to the grassroots with the community, that would be a win. And it has to be grant-based financing. Yeah. So with experts, yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for the very well-detailed answer. And there's, I guess, one more question, and then we'll be concluding our session, because I guess there won't be any questions. And this question is by Ms. Zainab Ranja, and she's asking that climate-related projects are usually financed by the international financial institutions. However, they are not structured to generate carbon credits. Does this indicate a gap in project design or in existing carbon market standards?
Sorry, can you repeat it again? I can try see it in the chat.
Yes, ma'am. So she asked that climate-related projects are usually financed by international financial institutions. However, they are not structured to generate carbon credits. Does this indicate a gap in project design or in existing carbon market standards?
Thank you for that. So the whole issue of carbon markets, if I can touch a bit of it. So carbon markets began with the Kyoto Protocol. We had the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, and I know for a fact there's been a lot of lobbying and advocacy around, and growing interest on issues around carbon markets and per se. It's not entirely true that the international finance institutions are not funding projects that are related to carbon markets. Because it's not entirely true per se. I feel like, because I did an application for the African Development Bank, which is a very easy one, and they did have, you can put that, it could be one of the potential outputs, but not the core of it. Basically, it could be like a side thing per se. The GCF, I have not seen a bit of engagement within that, basically. But I think for the financial mechanisms, the GCF and the JEF, the banks aside, basically, it could be one of the proposals that we could table as guidance of the COP to the GCF, the JEF, to be able to include, carbon. It's a very simple project. What happens is we go to COP negotiation rooms, and your country, can propose, of course, that we have carbon market projects as part of the projects that GCF, the JEF are going to be financed, because we do have that mandate to include it there if it's not entirely lacking. Yeah, so I I I don't think per se it's like accurately that they are not included, but I know that most of the carbon market project attract more of the bilateral financing, because when you look at 6.2, for example, it's government to government. Basically, it's Article 6 carbon market is about, lack of better, it's even worse. It's like business. There is no environmental integrity, or you're conscious, you pledge allegiance to be environment. It's all about business, return on investment, and most of the time it's one government to the other government. A bank may come in, but the main players is government. For example, you have an agreement with government of Sweden and Switzerland, Kenya and Switzerland. That is it. So financial entities are non-entities. So it's two countries, they sit down and talk to each other, and they agree. Basically, we're going to do this together. And under 6.2, you just register it under the UNFCCC. The 6.4, which is being phased out eventually, or the CDM that has moved into 6.4, is a bit, controlled by the UNFCCC. So a bit of that. But for 6.2, which is the future of Article 6, it is more of bilateral. But you could, of course, I don't see any harm in having a bit of inclusion in your project application to the financial institution, saying one of the outputs we generate is carbon credits, because they are not the buyers, basically. So in this case, the international financial institution could just be facilitating you to engage in carbon trading, so because they cannot buy the carbon credits. Carbon credits are bought from country to country, one country to the other, and they do the math, and they do, of course, the corresponding adjustments. But they could facilitate engagement, they could facilitate that, but they are not per se aligned. But like I said, it's something that if you go to negotiations and through your country, it could be tabled, and we could have a guidance if all countries agree, if there's no objection, if they don't see any harm. They could have a guidance to the GCF, the JEF, to be able to potentially have that as part of the criteria for accessing, unlocking financing in those institutions. Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am, once again for answering the question. So, guys, if you have any question, you may ask. Otherwise, we will wrap the whole session that we today commenced. And before concluding the whole session, I would like to please request all of you to please turn on your cameras so that we can have a group photo, and then we may be concluding our session. So please take a moment, and I would like to request you all, if you all are comfortable, then you may please turn on your cameras. And we will be clicking a snapshot picture with our guest speaker. Okay, I guess others are not feeling that much comfortable. So we'll now be properly commencing and clicking the snapshot. I'd like to request all of you, you can do any sign that you like. Just even a victory sign is also good. And we will be doing it 3. Okay, ready? 3, 2, 1. Once more, And we are good to go then. Ready? You all are requested. 3, 2, 1. Okay. So now let's just move to our concluding session. So thank you all for being part of this session today. And before we conclude, I would like to personally take a moment to express our gratitude and reflect on what we have just witnessed today. And firstly, to all distinguished guest speaker, uh, thank you, ma'am, for generously sharing your time, expertise, and insights with us. Your perspective, grounded in the real challenges of adaptation, mitigation, loss and damage fund, and opportunities facing Kenya and the broader African continent, has illuminated the critical role that international financial institutes play in advancing climate action. And Abdullah, you have raised your hand. If you have any question, you may ask, or okay. So with that being said, let me just continue. So more importantly, ma'am, your advocacy for equitable, accessible, and effective climate finance reminds us why this work matters so deeply. We hope this is the very first of many conversations with you, and I really look forward to seeing you in our upcoming workshops on different topics regarding climate change, adaptation finance, mitigation finance, and the whole topic of climate finance as well. And to our fellows and participants, this is where the real work begins. The insights shared today are not meant to be merely intellectual exercises. They are a call to action, whether you are in policy, finance, civil society, or the private sector. And with that being said, the challenges ahead are immense, but so is the opportunity before us. Through dialogues like today, through collaboration, and through unwavering commitment to climate justice, we will build and we can build a climate finance system that truly works for all. Thank you to Ms. Dolphine Magero for lighting the way. And thank you to all of you for your dedication to this cause. The Climate Finance Leadership Series will continue, and we look forward to seeing you all at our next session. Thank you so much to our distinguished guest speaker once again, and looking forward to seeing you all on another day. Thank you. Good night. Please take care of your health.
Thank you as well. Thank you.